This program is made possible in part by Nebraskans for Public Television. Consider This, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bale Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hi, and welcome back to UNO and to Consider This. Our guest this week is Milo Mumgard. And I think, Milo, by the way, this is one of the coolest names in the universe. I've just always wanted to say that to you.
Yeah.
But what a lot of people think is cool is what you do. Milo's executive director of the Nebraska Appleseed Center for Law in the Public Interest. And we should say that Milo was recently selected as one of 20 winners of a National Leadership Award sponsored by the Ford Foundation. And it's quite a prestigious award.
Thank you.
Before we go any further, I do want to say that it's that time of year again when the special people at Rose Court at Eagle Run Square at 129th and Maple in Omaha provide us with a little bit of a festive flair because the Student Center could use it, and so can our show. You are a group, or you represent a group, Nebraska Appleseed, that's part of a kind of a larger national picture, but it's a group that people are really akin to, or they just don't have much space for you. Explain a little bit what you do.
Well, Nebraska Appleseed is a nonprofit law project, which is sometimes a little difficult to conceptualize. What we try to do at Nebraska Appleseed is try to join legal skills that are otherwise out there and available to certain members of our communities. Trying to join those legal skills with the sort of systemic issues that face low-income people, marginalized people like new immigrants, those kinds of folk. Try to provide real sophisticated legal skills on their behalf, and to try to do it on a systemic level, which is basically public policy, class action litigation, the kinds of work that makes a difference for a lot of people at one time. And that's what we try to do at Nebraska Appleseed. And you're right, it is part of a national network. The Appleseed Foundation we're affiliated with the Appleseed Foundation, which was created by a group of Harvard Law School graduates from 1955 or something like that, who were trying to make sure that there was a public interest law presence like this in states across the country that didn't have a history or tradition of that sort of thing. And Nebraska obviously is a place that doesn't really have a tradition of public interest legal work of the sort that we do at Nebraska Appleseed. So that's sort of the origins of our work here.
We want to jump into some of the issues, but actually it was a group of Nebraska lawyers that kind of got it going.
In fact, it was a group of Nebraska lawyers, both with the Harvard Law connection and just people in the state who cared about this. The original board, in fact, was, and again, the important thing about this is nonpartisan. We've had Republicans, Democrats, Independents, people who really care about making sure that constituencies that don't ordinarily get this kind of sophisticated legal help get this kind of sophisticated legal help. For example, one of our original board members, founders, was former Governor Bob Crosby, as well as Var Johnson here in Omaha, a longtime attorney in this area. And Jim Wolf from Albion, Nebraska, a Harvard Law grad from like 1948, something like that. So these are people who really care, and once they were presented with the opportunity that the Appleseed Foundation and others presented here to create something here in Nebraska, us Nebraskans got together and created Nebraska Appleseed.
Before we get to some of the specific things that you've been doing, I know that in covering news for years that I have seen individual small groups of lawyers, or with some public help to do this, or private, struggling on a case by case basis to help those that are indigent, those who are trying to fight, not fight a system, but try to say, hey, the system might be failing me or a group of people, and that we need to have those people out kind of one-on-one working with individual people.
That's absolutely right.
But also, you're saying you also need to go to the other extreme and work within the system whether it's the court system or the law system, making law, making public policy.
That is absolutely right. And I wouldn't say it's an extreme. It's part of
Well, I
the
guess
same
continuum.
picture. That's right, the continuum.
But it's a different space
I know what
on
you're
the
saying.
continuum.
The individual legal representation of individuals, say, who have a domestic relations problem, victims of domestic violence, for example, people with a housing problem or getting evicted, those kinds of cases, these people need legal help. And Nebraska Legal Services and pro bono help across the state from private attorneys is really the source of that legal help. But it can only serve, even that effort can only serve a small fraction of people's problems. So what Nebraska Appleseed is doing as part of this continuum of services, legal services, is we say, well, how can we do things in a sophisticated way that might actually help a lot of people at one time?
Or are you seeing a trend where there's a
Yes.
loophole, or there's a niche in the fair treatment, which maybe was intended when a law was passed,
That's
but
right.
it didn't quite shake out that way?
And that is exactly right. So if each individual that's not being treated fairly,
That would be inefficient.
terribly inefficient.
And a lot of people, it would take too long to figure all that out. So
That
you
is
try to
absolutely
focus in. One of the things that you had a little success. We've had a number of successes, and I'm sure some disappointments. But you've been concerned from the beginning of welfare reform that the whole concept of X date comes, you're off the welfare rolls if you don't have a job, and boom. And you were concerned about that even before the deadline came, but after the deadline you found that there was some work that needed to be done by you and other interested people, and certain welfare mothers that needed training and things, and that they weren't cut off from the
Yeah.
system. Describe your sort of big case and what it led to.
Well, when we created the Appleseed program in about 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, so we're a little over 5 years old, we actually went out and interviewed community leaders, civic leaders, people involved in working with low-income communities and so on, and said, what would be some of the issues that we really should deal with on this kind of level? And of course, welfare reform was off the charts. That was definitely something that had to be addressed.
Now, did you just talk to like real liberal, kinds of folks, or did you talk to possible constituents of your services, or did you hit a lot of bases when you?
We tried to hit a lot of bases. Clearly, a lot of the people we were talking with are people who are service providers and others who really have that hands-on interaction with people.
They're in the trenches.
So they might actually be a little bit biased towards, this issue needs to be addressed.
But they were in the trenches, people,
In the
with
trenches.
real experience, not
That's
just this
right.
is, I'm thinking this up in my head.
That's right. Not people sitting around, idly wondering what should be done.
Philosophizing.
That's right. So we wanted to be real practical about it and real impacting about what we're doing. So that was a way of getting us to a point where we could figure out what to do. And welfare reform is clearly that issue area. But along with the changes in the laws and the rules, we were looking at, well, what about the opportunities for these low-income people? Welfare reform was all about moving people who are having to use the welfare assistance more significantly into the labor market, being supported by the labor market. So the question obviously was, well, is the labor market going to support these families? And is it going to be able to help them move up and out of poverty? And so therefore, a lot of our legal work over the last 5 years has been all about, if not all of our legal work, has been to make sure that the original law that was written by the Nebraska legislature about moving people up and off of welfare and out into the community and up and out of poverty was fully engaged, that there were all the promises made about child care, job training, all those kinds of things were
Insurance
actually
for the children.
Insurance for the children, all of those things were lived up to. While simultaneously we worked on, well, what about the living wage opportunities for these families? Is government actually doing the things that they've promised to try to make sure that those opportunities exist? And is the community responding? And are there things that we can do as lawyers working with community groups to try to make sure that happens? And so there's a lot of legal work that we've done. And it basically boils down to quite a few class action lawsuits that we litigate. We also do a lot of work at the legislative level and the city council level, but it's all around the basic idea that we want to help these welfare recipients find and keep living wage jobs. And if it means we have to file a lawsuit that establishes that, well, you have to give them opportunity, or if we have to file a lawsuit that says, well, you're cutting people off before they're prepared, under the law they're not supposed to be cut off, or you're not providing help to their children, we obviously have filed those suits and will continue to file those suits because that's the work that we do.
What suits that you have filed have resulted in a clear-cut, and I won't say victory, but a clear-cut step into to following the path that everybody really wants, I think, is that we have fewer people on welfare,
Right.
but with on that path, you say, as to full employment and not in poverty.
And out of poverty, that's exactly right. Well, one of the most important provisions in the Nebraska welfare reform laws was the promise that actually, well, not a promise, it was actually a guarantee that really what the law is about is not to cut people off of welfare, but is to help them build their human capital so that they can become economically self-sufficient. And one of the ways of doing so was, of course, giving people access to education and job training. And one of the more significant legal victories we've had at Nebraska Appleseed is to establish that, yes, indeed, the law says that and means that. The Nebraska Supreme Court has found in our client's favor once, and now has the issue before them again, that establishes that the right to education and continuing education is a fundamental premise
Now,
of the welfare reform.
What do you mean,
process.
right? That the constituents in Nebraska, the taxpayers, have to pay for that education, or that they, while pursuing education, they not be cut off welfare, or a combination?
It's pretty simple, actually. The families that receive assistance, and again, ADC is only, cash assistance is only provided to families with children. That's where the C comes from, children. So in these contexts, we have a mother with children, and it very well could be that pursuing further education, whether it's in a vocational area or in a higher education area that will lead to a college education and a higher paying job, under the law, she has the right to do that as a work activity while the family is receiving assistance.
So it shouldn't be held against her that she is not working 40 hours a week and taking care of
Absolutely,
that family when
absolutely.
she might be working some, she might be educating herself, as an investment to really staying off welfare.
That is exactly right. And these families are people who are working, as you said, working a little bit, part-time work here, getting some assistance for the children here, and also going to school and getting other forms of assistance to go to school. Meanwhile, keeping it all together and ultimately getting to their goal, which is some level of education that will lead to a better and higher paying job, which undoubtedly is meeting the goals of the original Welfare Reform Act, which is to help them become economically self-sufficient. So that's one very important victory we've won, is that that's the law in Nebraska.
And from a public policy point of view, we keep reading that we're losing people from the state. We don't want to lose those that don't have ties. In other words, they get out of high school, go somewhere else to be educated, or they get educated here, and then young people often like to leave. These are people that are connected here.
Oh, absolutely.
And once you start getting kids in school and raising children, so we actually tend to be investing in that which is the goal of most of us, which is to home grow people, keep them, and then maybe get a few more in too and build the state.
That is absolutely right. We have an asset that we're trying to take advantage of, trying to develop.
Value added.
There you go. And we talk about the human capital, the value added stuff all the time. Unfortunately, the culture and the sort of idea of welfare reform that seems to permeate discussions about welfare reform seems to focus only upon have we lowered the welfare rolls? Are there fewer families receiving welfare? Those kinds of things. And the answer to that is yes, we have lowered the welfare rolls and there are fewer families receiving welfare. But are we actually achieving the objective of welfare reform? Are we helping families to get up and out of poverty, to become economically self-sufficient?
And wasn't that the idea of welfare
Absolutely.
originally, in that we got so far flung so far away from it, that's why people were angered. I mean, the word welfare made a lot of taxpayers just really angry because they saw this institution that people were stuck in, and that's not where you're at all.
Well, and people were stuck in it not because so much the system itself was causing them to be dependent upon the system. There's a lot of complexity to this, but it basically boils down to, in Nebraska, our welfare population is just a subset of our working poor population. People come in and out of the welfare system, so to speak, all the time, receiving cash assistance when they've been laid off of a job or had a domestic violence problem or a child care problem or significantly a health care problem. How do you get health care? Well, you might have to go and apply for welfare. So given that, it's sort of a misnomer to think in terms of these people are dependent upon and living off of the welfare system, and we have to do things to get them cut off. In Nebraska,
that's what you consider your income option.
Right.
My income option is welfare, and that's where I want to be.
Right. And the way to get them up and off of welfare is exactly what we've been talking about. Do the various things that help them to become self-sufficient, sustainable, outside of needing to occasionally turn back to the state and the taxpayer for assistance. And that's our goal too. We fully believe that that's exactly what welfare reform should be doing.
Now, one of the things that fits into this is the living wage.
Correct.
Which you had success with the last Omaha City Council passed a living wage ordinance, or they did, that basically said that city contractors over a certain amount would have to pay a living wage. Then the new council decided they didn't, and campaigned, many of them, on the fact that they would try to get rid of that. They didn't feel that was the role of government.
Right.
Have you given up on living wage?
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, it's very active at the whole concept of making sure that public funds are not used to pay or subsidize sub-poverty wages is very active. At the legislature, for example, there is an initiative at the legislature to build that into a lot of what goes on in terms of state law. Also at the Lincoln level, at the Lincoln City Council, they're going to be considering that in due time. And also there are communities around the state that have asked Appleseed to provide assistance on those kinds of discussions and those policy debates. In other words, every time public funds are used, we should be also thinking about, in fact, that's kind of like the right hand here. The left hand is all this welfare reform we've just been talking about, which is let's cut people off of welfare, let's move them off of welfare, and so on. But if on the right hand we're spending public funds to pay sub-poverty wages and facilitating employers to pay sub-poverty wages with our public tax dollars, we're sort of working at cross purposes here. So all we're saying at Nebraska Appleseed and through our living wage work is let's just try to get those things put together. And that as a basic premise to start out with, we shouldn't be using public dollars to pay or subsidize sub-poverty wages.
You know, though, when I first heard about this, it seems to me that this is kind of an end run against legislators that are, on the national level, are primarily Republican. If you just figure the Senate and the House and add them all up, you're going to get, that don't want, and there's some Democrats too, that don't want an increase in the minimum wage. So we're going to find another way to get around this. And then what's going to happen is, and this is one of the, the criticisms of the living wage, is that then, those kinds of things feed inflation, and then public policy is determining what the free market should determine, which are wages, supply and demand,
Well, that's absolutely the arguments that are used against these kinds of this kind of work. But basically, all of those are untrue in the sense that nobody's trying to do a backdoor on the minimum wage at all. In fact, we support an increase in the minimum wage overall. All this really is saying is that if we're going to be using tax dollars, shouldn't we be having some significant shouldn't there be a significant consideration here? And that is, on the one hand, we're using tax dollars to pay sub-poverty wages or to support sub-poverty wages. Aren't we also using tax dollars to, say, provide child care and health care and food stamps and housing, those kinds of things as well? So we're just spending a lot of tax dollars here. Isn't there a meaningful question about how we're using these public funds? And isn't there a better way of using these public funds?
In other words, you can't have it both ways. I mean, you can't say that the wage, this is what you're saying, that the wage you're paying now, saying it's not this living wage, that it is fair to give them a lower wage, and yet we're paying out for these things, which maybe they could afford a little more. I mean,
that's absolutely right. And what happens is that when we wind up paying such low wages as employers, you and I as taxpayers are the employers here, when we allow those low wages to exist, we also at the same time, unfortunately, by paying out for all the welfare benefits that people that they need in order to survive, the reality is that creates the backlash that we've just been talking about. People get angry about this. Why are we spending so much money on welfare and so on and so forth? Well, one of the reasons we are is that we're facilitating low wages. Why don't we do something about what we use our public funds for and stop the facilitation of those low wages?
Don't we just need, or maybe this is what you're doing, I don't know, just a bigger public discussion, or maybe because you can't do these things in 20-second sound bites, the public doesn't get engaged. Can't you just make your case before the public,
Well, I think we're doing a pretty good job of that, actually. When I talk to people around the state, and people come to our website, which is neappleseed.org or neequaljustice.org, the two websites that we have.
Say that slower. You whipped it by.
Yeah, it's neappleseed.org, and then there is the Equal Justice Clearinghouse website, which is a project of Nebraska Appleseeds, which is at neequaljustice.org.
But you can find that from neappleseed.org.
That's true. You can just click right in there, and there you are. when we go out and visit with folks, and we have quite a good staff that gets out and visits with folks, and our board is regularly communicating with people around the state, we find that this kind of logical approach to what seems on the face of it to be sort of a twisted public policy debate and dialogue, people generally are very responsive to that. They really understand, gee, that makes sense. I mean, we want to help people get up and off of welfare. Everyone wants to do that. We want to make sure that our dollars are used in the most efficient way. We want to make sure that people are paid, if possible, at or above the poverty level, at least, so they can support their families. So are there some public policy ways of getting towards that goal? And the answer is yes, there are some public policy ways of getting towards that goal. So in terms of like the greater public dialogue on this, I think that we're part of that, and we want to promote a public dialogue about that. That's very important.
But you know, this may be a hard time to make headway. Our economy is contracting. State income, city income is going down, and it will contract for a while. It's just whether you call it cyclical or just the end of the world or someplace in between.
Hopefully cyclical.
You know, it might get a little tougher for you to get this public, ignite a little dialogue.
There's no question that, in times of good economic times, it's easier to make these kinds of arguments. In bad economic times, they're not as easy to make. But do the same principles apply? Do the same does the same logic apply? And the answer is yes. And
maybe even more so.
Even more so at this time. I mean, at this juncture, anything the state can do to facilitate low-wage people's wages and their benefits and so on is to the better.
Do you ever get the feeling, and I'm not trying to make anybody out to be the bad guy, but as I said, some people want their cake and eat it too. Let me bring up the ever-growing Hispanic population in Nebraska. One day you'll turn on the news or talk radio and you'll hear about this wave that's moving up from the south, the hordes, taking jobs, not learning to speak the language, and you might even hear that publicly from people. But then if you clamp down on immigration problems like the INS did during Operation Vanguard, what you won't hear are the meat packers and these companies that employ the Hispanics and others saying, get the INS to back off. And this is, I know this for a fact.
Sure.
Back off, because we need these people at these wages, because no one else will take these jobs at these wages. We kind of want it all.
That is absolutely right. And the whole issue area of how low-wage, low-skilled immigrant workers in our state, and Hispanics in particular, how we approach them in a public policy way, both at the federal level and the state level, you're exactly right. It's like it's very difficult for anybody who doesn't sort of work on that issue area to not come into the picture and say, well, why are you doing this and why are you doing that? Things are just sort of all over the place. It's because we have so many different sort of societal desires when it comes to all this stuff.
Well, then there's the public and the private desires.
That's right.
People will talk, maybe a little blustery, and I think there are concerns about immigration policy. Not that what's happening, the trend is wrong, but that these people are breaking the law, and they want to be a land of law, and they want some changes.
That's right.
But there just doesn't seem to be a real open discussion, except I think people screaming on radio talk shows and things.
Well, Operation Vanguard came about as that was a situation a couple years ago in which the INS cracking down on the meatpacking industry caused a crisis kind of situation for not just obviously the immigrant community, but also for the industry.
But also the meat packers didn't self-police, day after day, which would have not made it a crisis.
There's truth to that. But when you get these crisis moments, what we at Nebraska Appleseed found is that in thinking through the sort of systemic legal policy issues that we could be working on, is that gee whiz, everybody really is at the same place when you get right down to it, which is we need workers in Nebraska, we need people to fill these jobs, we need people to be here. And who are these people that are they're largely immigrants, are largely non-citizens and mostly Hispanic. And so therefore, when you get right down to it, the question becomes, how do we make sure these people can be here, have a stable life, and be able to have a life that can be here in mainstream Nebraska?
A life that, by the way, means buying homes, buying cars. They do send some of the money south.
Yeah,
but because they're supporting relatives, they're good family members.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, we keep saying them like they're either a bad guy or a good guy,
Right.
in aggregate.
And in truth, they are just like anybody else. The people that come here to work and live and have families and pay taxes, that's who we're talking about. And the question is, how do we facilitate that this happens in the most legal and efficient way?
But we have a language problem that exacerbates a lack of understanding and communication, and creates more of a separateness. And we haven't had major wave of non-English speaking people since probably my ancestors and some of your ancestors came. So we're
right.
not used to this kind of.
We are definitely not used to it, and that's part of the picture. Is that it's we have a linguistic, cultural sort of shaking up going on now.
Because it's one language, generally Hispanic, Spanish-speaking people.
Right.
It's almost a we/them, as opposed to when the Croatians and the Polish and the Czechs and the I don't know what's Mumgard.
Danish.
Well, and the Danes
It's
and
solid Dane.
came in. So it's just the dynamics are a little different.
The dynamics are very different, and that makes it even more complex. But when you get right down to it, it's the same thing. We have a wave of new immigrants coming into our state, and they're the same kind of phenomena that occurred for your ancestors and when my grandparents came over from Denmark, that kind of situation.
Yeah, which was basically that the parents worked really hard, supported a family, and it was their children that learned the language.
And that's exactly what
we forget
that. And that is an interesting thing, working on the policy level. We hear so much about we can't do things that promote speaking of Spanish, or that allows the speaking of Spanish, or if people want to apply for public benefits or assistance with their businesses or whatever, and we need to be communicating with them in Spanish, there oftentimes is a real sort of cynical attitude on the part of a lot of folks that, well, we can't do that because that's Spanish, that's not English. And our predecessors did, we've had to learn how to speak English, or our predecessors had to learn how to speak English. Well, the reality is that's exactly what's going on here as well. People are learning to speak English the same way that our predecessors and our ancestors did.
They learned it from their children who were learning it in the schools. Generally,
it's no big mystery here. It's just that the one significant difference, perhaps, though, is that there are, of course, there is a consciousness of how people, of the rights of people, or how do we more effectively deal with new populations and so on, that wasn't obviously 60, 80 years ago. And we also have a very strong public policy desire to have a diverse society that works together, and we have to work together. That's really the bottom line. And so there are some different considerations than perhaps there were 60 years ago. But when you get right down to it...
hopefully we're a little more civilized in some ways.
That's right.
We really have about 30 seconds.
Oh, wow.
People should check out your website to see some of the things that you're doing. One of the things that I just want to mention, so that if people are concerned about this issue, is cutting off heating.
Yes.
For people this coming winter. People still have bills from last year. But there are a lot of things that you're doing.
You can go on our website at anyequaljustice.org, and there is information about how do you deal with a situation where you're being threatened with a cutoff. We're also asking people to give us feedback about that issue. There may be a need for new public policy there.
All right. Thanks, Milo Mumgard of Nebraska Appleseed. If you're not familiar with it, check it out. Learn about what's going on in your state. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on Consider This.
This program is made possible in part by Nebraskans for Public Television.